Hi, welcome to my accessory dwelling unit. I'm about to give you a little tour of what's going on here. So this is the primary dwelling, and you can see the address there, 4227. But if you look down to the right of the main house, you can see the address 4227B. And it's kind of discreet, and what we're about to walk up to is a pretty large accessory dwelling unit. It's 800 square feet of habitable living space, 2 stories, but from here you can barely even tell that there's a house back there. I'll just point out a couple things that kind of define an accessory dwelling unit. Accessory dwelling units are secondary, diminutive housing units relative to the primary dwelling. And so in this case, it's a detached 800 square foot ADU. According to the Portland City Code, detached ADUs have to be behind the primary house, and that's also again to like make it diminutive or secondary to or ancillary to the primary dwelling. So that's what we have here. And so let's head on back and I'll show it to you. Notice that there's 2 electric meters here. 1 meter is for the primary dwelling, 1 is for the ADU. And here we are. So there's 6 feet of separation between the primary dwelling and the main house, and that's to meet fire code. Then we have this covered entryway here, and this is to get out of the rain. In Portland, there's a lot of rain year-round, or in most of the months of the year, so it's a best practice to have a covered entryway in general. Then you head on into the ADU. And here we are. So my wife and I live here. We built this place in 2011. We first purchased the main house, and then right away started doing the design work for the ADU. The design work took about 3 months, and we went through the permitting process. That took about an additional 3 months. Paid the permit fees, which were about $4,000 at the time. And the city is actually really good in Portland about promoting accessory dwelling units. They've waived some administrative fees associated with ADUs for the time being as an incentive to get homeowners to build them. So as a result of that, there's been a huge spike of ADU development ever since about 2010. So this was one of the first batch of those ADUs being built right after that waiver went into effect. So my wife and I live here. Now we rent out the front house, and that front house rental income offsets the mortgage for the entire property plus some. So it's a financially sustainable housing model, which housing is generally the most expensive cost that Americans have, and in this case, we are not just breaking even. It's a regenerative source of income. So that's an impressive thing relative to the way that most people are living and paying for housing, whether it's a mortgage or rent. There's nothing really that compares to being able to, I guess the only comparable thing would be like living in a room in a house and renting out the other rooms. That would be somewhat akin to this, except that in this case we have our own kind of dream house. We've designed this from scratch. We live in the place that we have always dreamed of. We have these little features that I'll show you that we're totally keen on, and it's private, so it's really great. So let me just give you a little taste of what's going on here. So this is our living area over here. We have this white wall, and why am I pointing a white wall out? Well, this is our movie screen. So we don't like TVs, they take up a lot of space, but this white wall turns into this like 5 foot tall, 8 foot wide, built-in surround sound, awesome movie screen where we watch Game of Thrones and tons of fun TV shows. So there's that. Then we have our dining area and our kitchen area. So it's a great room. Just like tiny houses on wheels, ADUs are small spaces, and it's critical to have a great room so that all those 3 spaces function and feel like they're much bigger than they really are. If these were split up into independent spaces like what you would find in a typical average house, each of these spaces would feel really small, but none of them feel small because they're all conjoined. Also, another thing that we have going on here is these really high ceilings. So even though this place is a 800 square foot ADU, it does not read as one. It's got 22-foot ceilings. What house have you been in that has 22-foot ceilings? Not very many. What house have you been in that has a 5x8 movie screen? So we are not really sacrificing much by living in this really small square footprint. We also have all of our windows facing south. So in Portland, it's pretty important to get as much natural light as possible. So we put all the windows orienting south. We kind of obscured the windows that are facing to the north, east, and west to some extent because there's adjacent structures and houses like 5 feet away from this house because this is by definition a form of urban infill housing. And so there's definitely impacts on the neighbors in terms of like impacting the degree of privacy that people have. So we did the best we could by not putting windows directly looking into people's properties, and we kind of oriented them this way into our yard. This house is also built to be really high performance house. So it has R33 insulation, R15 insulation, rigid foam insulation below. It's got radiant and floor heating. So it's definitely a really kind of high-end level of finishes. ADUs by definition can be used however the homeowner wants to use them. So whether that's the homeowner living in the ADU and renting out the primary house, or living in the primary house and renting out the ADU, or having a family member live in the ADU, or using the ADU as an office. You're really allowed to do whatever you want with it, at least in Portland. Unfortunately, that's not the case in most of the country. Most of the country, there's what are called owner occupancy requirements, which means that by definition, the owner has to live in one or the other of the units, which doesn't sound like a big deal, but it's actually a really big barrier to ADU development in most of the country. So if we wanted to, for example, move away to a different place, which we don't intend to do, we could rent out both units. But with owner occupancy requirements in place, you'd be forced to essentially sell the property if you were not going to live in one or the other. The reason that is so impactful is because it hurts the flexibility that you would get with the property ownership, which is one of the values of property ownership, is the flexibility to like tap into it financially and have the flexibility to use it however you wish. But by penalizing people with an owner occupancy requirement, it effectively forces people to not want to build permanent ADUs. What do? Instead? Well, they build unpermitted ADUs, and that's what's happening in most of the country, in most big cities. So I'm going to walk upstairs and kind of show you a couple things that are going on. So we have this winder set of stairs that goes up to a landing up here. And this winder set of stairs was really challenging to design because in small houses and tiny houses on wheels, staircases, if you're building them to code, they have to be 3 feet wide. That takes up a huge amount of space. So it's really challenging to design a staircase in a small house and not have it kind of ruin the floor plan. So in this case, we put it up along the wall. We did this winder stair. We did some really interesting turns just to get sufficient headroom as we were going up the stairs to meet building code, which requires that you have 6 foot 8 inches of headroom above each tread of the stair. And as we go up, I also wanted to point out we have this salvaged metal handrail, which is a guardrail, which is a remnant steel. The negative spaces were cutouts for machine parts. These are good examples of how to use salvage materials. Salvage materials are awesome. They're great in terms of having very low carbon impact and being locally sourced materials. The drawback of salvage materials is actually they're kind of expensive typically. At least in this market, they're expensive and you have to do a lot of work after the fact to work with them. So it doesn't really save money necessarily, but it's great to use them. And so this is a great example of something that was literally trash that was going to be thrown away and smelted. And we refabricated it, cut it into shape. Now it's this beautiful guardrail. So this is an alternating tread stair that goes up to our non-habitable space. That is an attic storage space, and I'll show you that in a minute. But as you walk down this hall here, one of the things I like to point out that's really a useful trick to think about with small houses is having a pocket door that separates the bathroom from the rest of the house, as opposed to a swinging door, which takes up a lot of square footage that you would otherwise be able to use. But more importantly, in this case, we have the sink outside of where the toilet and the tub are. And what that allows is for stacking of functions so that two people can use this bathroom at the same time without any conflict. And that's a great little trick to think about, putting the sink outside of where the toilet are and separating it with a pocket door. So come on through here and check out the cool tile work. So this is a really labor-intensive mosaic that my wife did, and it, because it's a small house, we were able to invest a lot of time and, frankly, money into every square inch of it. Because there isn't multiple bathrooms, there was just one. So this one bathroom took her, I don't know, maybe 50 hours or more to tile. Notice there's also a skylight above the tub here, and that gives us enough headroom to stand in that bathtub, because otherwise without that skylight we wouldn't have had sufficient headroom. But also that skylight simultaneously lets in a lot of natural light into the bathroom, which is really nice. Windows are a great thing to make houses look better, but in the case of ADUs, you have to be really careful about where you place them, because they are going to almost necessarily be looking into people's adjacent properties and houses, because these ADUs are always urban infill. So in this case, we have this window that is looking almost right into the window of the bedroom of the main house. So this is art that we have that's not just pretty, it's a great stained glass piece that shows the Portland skyline, but it's also functional in that it just prevents any privacy impacts that might occur if we didn't have something blocking out the line of sight to the other house. So this is an alternating tread stair. There's kind of three forms of gaining elevation. There's THOWs stairs, which, as I mentioned, are enormous. So they don't work in a lot of tiny houses and don't work sometimes well in ADUs. There's ladders, which are really steep, and they're great for really compact spaces. They don't meet any code requirements, but if you really only have a little bit of space to work with, ladders are pretty common. The drawback of ladders is it's kind of a hassle to use them in the middle of the night when you have to go pee, right? So you have to, it can be unsafe to do that. This is kind of the middle ground where it's not quite as steep as a ladder, but it's not as large and overwhelming as a THOWs stair. This is called an alternating tread stair, also known as a Jefferson stair. The drawback of a Jefferson stair or alternating tread stair is that you're forced into putting one foot in front of the other in the correct manner. But other than that, they're pretty great. They're also fixed generally instead of being mobile like a ladder, so you can't get them out of the way. These also don't meet any code. So this is going up to non-habitable space within the house. I'm just going to walk up it. All right, so this is a non-habitable space in the attic, and I just got up to the top of the alternating tread stairs. The reason why I say it's non-habitable is because, as you can see, even the peak of this roof is only 6'2". So you need to have 6'8" of headroom, at least in the Portland code, to have habitable living space. You need to have at least 70 square feet of space that's above 6'8". So this space isn't legally allowed for any habitation. Nonetheless, it's useful to have storage space, and I wasn't just going to sacrifice this space and cap it off when I could use it for storage and other things. So I'm going to walk back down the alternating tread stairs now. Notice it's pretty easy to walk down relative to, say, a ladder. My main interest professionally is working on environmental issues, and ADUs are a really great way to accomplish these huge environmental gains. And I just wanted to go over 4 things that are really critical to think about in terms of green building. Number 1, location. I've mentioned how this is urban infill housing. That means that I can walk places and bike places and take transit wherever I want. So therefore my transportation, utility, energy footprint is relatively low. That's a really big thing. The next big thing is the fact that this is necessarily has to be a small space. And so that's true of tiny houses on wheels, that's true of ADUs. They're both really small forms of structures relative to the average American footprint, which is 921 square feet per capita. This ADUs typically are going to be half that per capita. In this case, we have 2 people living in 800 square feet. So those 2 things are the biggest factors, really. That's 2/3 of one's carbon footprint in a house. Really, is just the size and the location. But if there's two other things to think about in terms of like building science or green building, I think they're really actually pretty mundane things. They are air sealing and insulation. So right now I wanted to just point out this wall cavity is 9 inches thick, and that's because we have what are called staggered studs in there. So it's 2 sets of 2x4s with 9 inches of insulation. Standard houses have like 4 to 6 inches of insulation, bat insulation, which I say is bad insulation. This is blown in fiberglass insulation, so it gets R33, which is a really pretty high performance kind of insulation. And then lastly, air sealing a house so that air doesn't easily leak out through the windows and doors and other cracks. Because if you heat up all the air in the house, or if you cool it down and then you have the like openings everywhere, all the energy and BTU, basically carbon that you're putting into heating and cooling a space will just leak out through those holes. So you really need to think about air sealing and insulation when you're thinking about weatherizing or making a house more, green or durable. And I would say this is more important than, say, investing money into a solar panel or investing money into using other high-end green building materials. I think just the basics of air sealing and insulation are really critical for reducing carbon footprints. Setbacks, if you're doing a legal permitted structure, typically you're required to adhere to a series of planning zoning regulations related to how large the structure is, or how high the structure is, and how far that structure must be from the property line. So this is our property line, and this is a structure. This is a 5-foot span, and so in Portland, the setback requirements for ADUs and any structure really are typically that the structure must be 5 feet from the property line, and that's to preserve sunlight and air can penetrate into the neighbor's properties. If the structure was right up against the property line, it was really high, you would be creating shadows on adjacent properties. So that's why you have setback requirements. Setbacks are pretty like mundane things, but when it comes to ADUs, every square foot counts on the property because you're building urban infill housing and you don't have a lot of space to work with. So if there was zoning regulations that required you have a 10-foot setback or a 20-foot setback, both of which you will find in the United States for ADUs, it kills ADUs. You can't build them, which is lame. Here in Portland, the setback requirements are 5 feet, so it's definitely possible to build ADUs in a lot of properties that have normal sized backyards. And in this case, we kind of put the ADU 5 feet from this property line and 5 feet from the property line that way, which results in the ADU being kind of shoved into the corner of the property, which means that we still have a yard left over. So there's basically 4 utilities that you have to think about. There's water, sewer, gas, and electric. I'm going to go through those 4 and how they relate to ADUs. Right beneath me right now is the sewer connection and the water connection. And what we've done here is simply extended the sewer from the primary house to the ADU. So we bore a hole through the foundation wall of the house. It goes into a trench and stubs up into the ADU there. Water, similar, is simply wide off of the water main that comes through the basement of the house and goes up into the ADU. The only thing that's kind of different about an ADU is that the occupant of the ADU must have access to a shutoff for the ADU without going through the primary dwelling, and the occupant of the primary dwelling must have access to a shutoff for their water without going into the ADU. So that in that case, if say we were on vacation for 6 months and there was a water leak going on, they could shut off the water in the ADU without affecting the main house and vice versa. So let's walk back this way now and I'll show you the gas and electric. So underneath us right now, there is a trench that has both the gas and the electric running up to the ADU. The electric starts right here. We have the meter B, which is designated for the ADU power, and the meter A, which is designated for the main house. No surprise, the primary house uses way more energy than the ADU because it's green, because it's small. But guess what? There's 4 people living in the primary house, so if you actually look at it on a per capita basis, it's not that different. The reason I bring that up is because I talked about how having a smaller footprint is like the biggest thing you can do in terms of reducing your footprint, but it's really thinking about that on a per capita capita basis. So if you're living in a big house alone, that's not so great. But if you're living in a big house with, say, 6 people, that's not so bad. Thinking about living on a per capita basis of like 400 square feet or so per capita is a good metric to determine how big your environmental footprint is in terms of your housing. So let's go through the gas utility here. So just like electric, there's gas running up to the property, and here we have 2 meters. 1 meter feeds the primary house and 1 meter feeds the ADU. Just like electric, they both have their own administrative bills, so you could theoretically shut off the gas to the ADU without shutting off the gas to the primary house. So it's really independent from the house in many ways, and that's set up by design so that you could have 2 separate renters in both units, and they wouldn't have that much impact on one another in terms of how they're using energy and water and all those things. Okay, so just to spend a minute here talking about the differences between ADUs and tiny houses on wheels, there's a few things that are really important to tease apart. Unfortunately for ADUs, they're much more expensive to build. The foundational loan for an accessory dwelling unit is like $15,000. So ADUs are like $180,000. So a whole different ballpark in terms of cost. Tiny house on wheels might be $30,000 to $50,000. ADUs are going to be like, $120,000 to $200,000 in this market. Although there are different forms of ADUs, some can be much less if you're converting a garage or converting a basement. So those can be as little as $40,000 sometimes, but that's pretty unusual. If places don't have good ADU codes, they're not really leaving homeowners with a lot of options if they need to have a secondary dwelling on their property for housing a family member or one reason or another. So that is in part what forces people to want to have a tiny house on wheels, the lack of the ability to build a small secondary housing unit on their property legally. So what are they going to do? Well, they're going to live in an RV, a tent, a yurt, a camper, or a tiny house on wheels, or something, because there's a need for that, right? So that's in part what's happening is people are figuring out ways to create affordable housing because the city, their jurisdiction effectively is banning affordable housing through the disallowance or the effective disallowance of building these accessory dwelling units. So that's one distinction. Also, just to be clear, tiny house on wheels are always on wheels. They're typically like 200 square feet or less. They aren't necessarily built to code. They aren't necessarily built by professionals with licenses, electricians and plumbers. ADUs must use licensed plumbers, must use licensed electricians. You must submit a set of plans that have been drawn up by a professional designer or architect typically. They must be approved by the city. Oftentimes you have to involve banks to finance these things. Then you have to get insurance. So you're entering into the kind of conventional housing regime when you're building an accessory dwelling unit. Honestly, the biggest drawback of tiny house on wheels is where do you put the damn thing? So many people go down the path of building a tiny house on wheels and then they end up in this place where they have no idea what they're going to do with it. And that's kind of an unfortunate reality that people have to confront when they complete their tiny house on wheels. Is it's hard to find a place to put it. You have to if you want to live on a residential property, you have to find a willing host who's willing to take, the risk of placing a tiny house on wheels on their property, knowing that they're not really explicitly allowed to do that. Of course, the advantage of a tiny house on wheels is if you do get slapped on the wrist by the city, you can always move it, which sounds easy enough, but the reality is you have to find a place to move it, and that tends to be a real challenge. That's kind of like a brief distinction between the tiny houses on wheels and ADUs, which in general in the media are conflated under the term tiny homes. But I like to just make clear that they are extremely different housing products in almost every way, except that they are both smaller than the average American dwelling, and that they have the opportunity to create really cool kinds of alternative infill housing in cities.
Hey guys, it's Alexis.
And Christian.
Thank you very much for watching our video.
Yes, and subscribing to our channel.
And don't forget to check out more tiny house stories
and tours.
Oh, and don't forget to join us on Patreon.
And again, don't forget to subscribe.
See you next time.
Take it easy, guys.